I think we're all aware, I think we're all aware that we are looking at this book, Conversation with Christ, Quaker Meditations on the Gospel of John by Doug Gwyn. And obviously, if we've all read the book, or at least some portion of it, we know what it's about, but I'll give a quick synopsis nonetheless. So the book is 13 conversations that the author has taken from the Gospel according to John, and each chapter is really a conversation in the sense that the particular story component of Scripture is examined in some I feel pretty in-depth, insightful ways in and of itself prior to the section then dealing with material from the Quaker tradition related to that passage, or Quaker concepts related to the material in that passage. And then probably at least to me, the most attractive part of the book, the guided conversation component that basically enables the reader to engage directly with the living Christ here now, through kind of the vehicle of what the Scripture and the elements from the Quaker tradition are telling us. It sets that stage for you then to step into a space where you're having a current contemporary experience of the aspects, or I guess components of the Christ experience that's been related through the historical text. And I think that that's definitely a neat approach, one that attracted me to the book and that I found helpful. The author talks about that the conversation component with Christ advances conversion to Christ, which I thought was an interesting way of putting it. And again, following the anagogical approach, the big kind of a mouthful of a word, but that style of reading that he describes, kind of lifting the story beyond just the historical circumstances that is being reflected in the Scripture, and bringing it kind of into a space where we can experience Christ on a higher level in the here and now. And I thought that was helpful, and also not really an experience I had before, as far as the scenarios being presented the way that they are in the book. I think we're all probably familiar with situations in which you're taught to pray. Prayer is talked about pretty regularly in any form of Christianity. And of course, Quakerism talks a lot about the inward light, inward experience, and encounter with Christ. But I thought that Doug Gwyn had done a great job here by kind of creating these kind of specified scenarios, almost like guided meditations, which you're more apt, in my experience, to encounter in maybe other religious traditions, not necessarily Christian religious traditions. And I thought that was attractive as well, to kind of have a opportunity to engage with the individual guided conversations. And so as I read along, I took notes in each of the conversations, as well as the he calls them guided conversations. Again, to me, they feel in some ways like meditations. And felt, I think I went probably through the first 6, I thought would be a good maybe point to nail down for this first session, depending upon how things kind of go and how we proceed. I think there are a couple of different ways maybe we could do this, and I'll just kind of open that up to other folks and see what they think. Of course, there's always the option to simply proceed through the conversations chronologically and kind of look at what we got out of them, or we might also simply spend our time discussing if we had a preferred conversation out of those first six. If you read one and it really resonated with you, or the guided conversation part of it really resonated with you. I definitely liked all of them, but there were a couple that I think I related to maybe a little bit more than others. So I might just kind of open the floor now and see if there was any one of them that stood out particularly, or if anybody wanted to share anything about their experience of particularly maybe the guided conversation, or really anything that you had encountered in the book that you thought was helpful or interesting. Okay. Well, I might just get a little step off here and see if that's helpful. So I think with the first conversation, he talks. It's dedicated to the subject of disciples, and there's this theme there which I thought was very interesting, where Jesus asks the apostles, John and Andrew, what are you looking for when they approach him? And I felt like that was really kind of the thrust of this one. And the book does a great job of bringing that question. It kind of operates on two levels simultaneously in this conversation, where you're reading the context specifically of John and Andrew asking Jesus where he's staying, and he says to them, come and see. So you have these two levels where there's the conversation that happened at that time, but then you can also see how you're getting pulled increasingly by the way the book is structured into encountering that language now. So you have the idea of Jesus asking you, what are you looking for? That's an interesting, idea to contemplate. And the whole concept of Christ saying to them, come and see, by extension, he's saying that to us as well. And that really opens the floodgates for a direct and very personal experience of Christ. And I think that's really the purpose of the book. At the end of the day, is bringing that into a contemporary experience. This particular conversation, it has the episode of Jesus naming Simon Peter and calling him to become something more than he's been up to that point in his life. And, that renaming, and what, if you're obviously familiar with the text, obviously Peter goes on to be this central figure, but you're plugging into that language of the what are you looking for, and the come and see, and you have the evidence of what that looks like for the apostles that are present in this conversation, included among them Peter. So it lets you kind of look at their lives as far as what we know became of them, this utter change in their lives, what their lives had been up to that point, what they took on in becoming part of this movement, becoming part of this community. There's really some high stakes that are on the other side of the question of, where are you staying, and being told by Jesus, come and see. That's a pretty pivotal space of change for these people. And, that's coming. They probably did not at the time. So I think that the book is really good in that, because that, it's inviting you into that same experience, but you also kind of know from that starting point, well, this is likely, if I allow it to have a similar effect on my own life experience as it did these people we now regard as apostles. And it's something as simple as this conversational exchange that becomes utterly life-changing for these people in ways that, they couldn't possibly have imagined. The chapter also deals with, it talks about, for example, Philip, the exchange with Philip, Jesus calling him to a conversion to himself, a conversion to Christ, and how that involves, the conforming of a life to the example of Christ. You also have the exchange with Nathaniel, same language that's previously used by Jesus. The come and see language appears again. And you also have Jesus claiming in this conversation for himself the title of Son of Man. And I felt like that Doug Gwyn does a good job of delving into, what does that mean? And the significance that that had in the Jewish world at that time, that these folks would have had some concept of what this meant, but like how well it was defined, it still has, or it did to me, kind of an amorphous feeling, it's like it was spelled out exactly, but this was a figure that had been foretold in Judaism, that would be this prophetic figure kind of along the lines of Moses. So the stage was set for them to understand what that might mean. But then in the Christian narrative, particularly in John, it goes on to become something much more probably than you would have expected given Jewish tradition. The whole idea of a human being divine or the Son of God, that would have been pretty shocking and frankly scandalous to Jews of that day. That was not what they were looking for in terms of a Messiah. They were not looking for a divine being. They were looking for somebody along the lines of the historical King David, certainly anointed and chosen by God to liberate Israel, to bring God's kingdom on earth. But by the time you get to the writing of the Gospel of John, which would have been considerably, decades after the death and resurrection of Jesus, you've got a Christianity that definitely had parted company pretty strongly from the Judaism that was its origin point. So I think that that's interesting to me too about this conversation. As I was reading it, I was kind of dealing with the reality that these people who Jesus is telling he's the Son of Man, what exactly were their expectations about that? And, what does that mean even for us today as well? I really liked the quote from Sarah Blackborough in the Quaker tradition section. She witnesses, I think the language he uses, that she witnesses to an inward Christ that is transgendered. She talks about wisdom and the personification of wisdom as female that you get in the Hebrew Bible. So, and there's like a correlation between Christ's conversation with his disciples and the inward experience of early friends and then ours today. And I think that this first conversation, as I read it, it's one of the things that kind of made me appreciate this book was for that reason, that it was in fact a way to take what feels in some ways foreign to us. I think when you're reading the Bible, even if you've spent an entire life familiar with it, there's a lot that's culturally, historically foreign. And yet these conversations are saying, here's the retelling of what happened at the time of, Jesus' historical life. But you can bring that forward in the here and now and have this encounter, have this exchange in the here and now in a way that's not only consistent with what they would have experienced then, but also experiencing what the early friends experienced as well. I think somebody joined us.
A couple things that struck me, especially in the first part, you pointed out, but one was when Jesus asks, what are you seeking? What are you looking for? And it reminded me of the Old Testament section on Joseph when he goes to look for his brothers and encounters a stranger who asks him, what are you looking for? And that stranger, after he answers the question, then points him to where his brothers had been. And there was a wonderful, I can't remember the rabbi's name, but he gave a sermon on, because of that question, we're here today. Because somebody who he said was an angel, as defined by Judaism, a messenger from God, which could be a heavenly being or a human being with a specific message, asked Joseph, and if Joseph hadn't answered, then he would have never gone to where his brothers were. He'd never gotten sold into slavery. The children of Israel would have never been enslaved and then taken out of Egypt, and they would have and on and on and on. And he concludes the sermon and he goes, and because of that question, we're here today. It's the lineage of a people of faith. And it seems that way if we want to continue it on past the Jewish tradition the same way. These questions are seemingly innocuous at a surface level, but what are you looking for? And so the parallel between it and that Joseph story struck me again when I read it. And the other part that you mentioned about Peter, when Jesus changes his name, the Old Testament parallels obviously with Abram and Sarai, who have their names changed to Abraham and Sarah. And Jacob gets his name changed to Israel, which becomes the name of the country. And then later on, of course, or the name of a people, rather. And then later in the New Testament, of course, we have Saul, who's changed to Paul. So names, of course, meant a lot back then. They were more than just a name. It stated your characteristics. And so I thought, once again, Jesus is following very much the rabbinic tradition and calling to mind phrases or life changes that the people he's talking to would be familiar with, that we modern Americans may not know at all or resonate with. And I like when on page 3, Gwyn towards the bottom says, as a rabbi, Jesus was a teacher in the ancient mode of instruction, which is much a matter of mentoring and modeling as it was didactic instruction. He just didn't say, here's what to believe, here's the correctness. He modeled the behavior and then tried to mentor. I think that 3-year mentoring of those disciples had to be extremely frustrating at times, but those were things that popped out for me, besides the Son of Man sections, which occur in the Old Testament, but not quite as predominantly.
Yeah, I think for me, the kind of pursuant to what you were talking about too, with the names and the significance of that and what that can kind of portend in terms of the history of biblical characters, etc. The whole experience of reading this book really, to me, put at the center in a way that I've really found is unique, in my opinion, at least, to Quakerism, is the centrality of this idea of the direct encounter in the here and now with the living Christ. And I think that that's something that why a book like this is so good is there, unfortunately, there's a real soft peddling of that in a lot of Quakerism today. And I know it's not a popular thing to say that in some quarters, but that's it. Yeah, there's, I think, a hesitancy. You hear a lot of language like the spirit and so on. And so there's a real hesitance in some spaces to apply the label of Christ to that. And I find that astounding in some ways, especially because of how, particularly in the Gospel of John, you get a very universal understanding of what is meant by Christ and how, and you get it in the language of these conversations, how there's the person, Jesus of Nazareth, as this, manifestation of Christ, Jesus Christ, the anointed one. But at the same time, you still understand in the context of it that when we're talking about Christ, the Christ Spirit, we're definitely talking about a reality spiritually that goes beyond just the life of the historical Jesus of Nazareth, but is tied inextricably to it. And I think that this book does such a great job of really capturing that because you're dealing with the historical figure of Jesus very much, but still peeking through all of that, just the way that the Gospel of John functions, the way it's set up, its origins and influences, you're still getting that very universal understanding that, particularly following the resurrection, the Christ spirit that is accessible here today, the fullest, expression of it is made known to us through the life of Jesus of Nazareth. But what we're experiencing here now inwardly that's teaching us in the present is that universal Christ spirit, that logos, that concept that's really the living presence and mind of God that's accessible to all people at all times. And I think that Quakerism has such a unique opportunity to really present that hopefully that's not something that, gets kind of put on the back burner. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes that does. And it's an extraordinary simple way of approaching Christianity, and yet it's at the same time very profound because you're really, Quakerism really strips down all of these other components that you find in other forms of Christianity, the outward forms, to really zero in on that experience. And I think that, like this first guided conversation, it invites you to look at a time when you felt the leading from God, when you felt Christ say, come and see. Well, I mean, it immediately takes that experience into the very personal, when did you feel this? And if you've not, I think kind of implicit in that is the fact that the book's basically saying you can. And to set aside some times for silence and engagement with God and to invite that experience and to see more or less what happens. And he talks about how, we become more conscious even in our bodies of Christ's presence and leading. We learn to abide with Christ more steadily. And I think he invites you to fill in your body in that conversation where, you have that experience. And if you read historical, Quaker writings about centering down, there's this sense, I'm trying to think of the gentleman's name. He wrote a book on Quaker prayer cycles. It's a really good book. And he talks the whole centering down process being there's a physical dimension to that, when you're meeting for worship where you're kind of turning inwardly and you're putting an inward, even physical focus on your inward self, not to your conscience. That's can be part of it, but to the inward light of God and Christ in your conscience. And there's a physical dimension to that. And I feel like here he's really inviting you identify, where am I feeling that? If I set aside time, I'd go through this guided conversation about, when did I feel Christ saying to me, come and see? When did I feel a leading? It's really taking it in a direction you don't necessarily hear a lot, where there's even that acknowledgement that there can be a physical dimension to that. And I think that was interesting to me too, about that initial conversation, that idea of it's really involving your whole person, your mind, everything, also your body in that experience. And I think obviously meeting for worship has, in the Quaker tradition, that physical dimension too, because sometimes it's about having to get out of your own way, slow your thoughts, redirect yourself toward an inward focus, to create the opportunity for this kind of experience to occur, inwardly speaking. Anyone else have any thoughts about the first conversation or anything we've said so far?
Just say, I think the guided conversations could really be well used in a group setting, especially for a congregation, because we often come together, say, for meeting for worship and do some sharing about what's gone on that week or whatever. But we don't often talk about our spiritual journeys and share those things in an open kind of way. And these seem to be like they could really be helpful to get people to know each other, in the old Quaker phrase, in that which is eternal. So where are we on our different life's passages, and what can we learn from each other as well, and about each other, that can help us understand perhaps other things about each other.
And I think so. I think it would be interesting to pursue some of these in a group setting for that very reason. I think that'd be fascinating to see how people experience them.
Maybe we ought to plan an in-person retreat someplace and get together and do those. That could be
that would be neat to do. I would be all for it. Then I guess if nobody has anything further on the first conversation, we maybe can look at the second one, which is the conversation with Nicodemus. One thing that I thought was interesting here is the use of night and daytime that he brings into it. So the conversation that he has with Nicodemus, he being Jesus, occurs at night, and you have him observing how, is this because Nicodemus is in the dark, kind of metaphorically speaking, because you have Nicodemus as a teacher, kind of an authoritative person within Judaism, but he's kind of like Jesus curious. He's like willing to approach this individual who definitely does not have the favor of the religious establishment of the day. And yet he's approaching him with respect and recognizing him as a teacher from God. That's an interesting reflection on him. And he's a teacher of the law. And while Judaism at this time certainly was its deeply spiritual components, it was very much law focused. It was very much, your holiness was determined by the extent to which you were keeping the Mosaic law. And there were very much outward signs of that, of religious observance, the things you abstained from, how frequently you did and didn't do certain things. And yet you have Jesus calling people to this more direct and immediate experience of God in a way that isn't really tied up in keeping the letter of the law per se, which would have certainly been controversial. And he's never, hostile to it, but you can tell it's not, with his healing on the Sabbath and just kind of the way he approaches it, he's much more spirit of the law oriented than letter of the law. And that would have been a real lead balloon with the religious authorities of the day. And we see that it in fact is that. And he ends up dead as a result, or executed as a result. And so there's this language about, rebirth in the spirit. You have a lot in John of people misunderstanding Jesus' words. And Nicodemus is one of these people, despite the fact that he is a teacher of the law. He would have been regarded as someone who would have a great deal of knowledge in religious matters. Yet Jesus, he can't get his mind around Jesus' words around this whole rebirth in the spirit concept. It's just he's just not getting there. And Gwyn talks about Jesus calling him to the realm of truth, and it's beyond both literal and literary understandings of the words. And it's very experiential in that sense. It's like, to get what he's saying to Nicodemus about rebirth, you're really having to think outside the box. And you could kind of think how a person would have difficulty in this social cultural context, maybe getting what Jesus is saying, especially if you were very steeped in this religious tradition as it was practiced in that day. I thought it was very interesting too that Gwyn suggests that the whole passage about it, you must be born of water and in the spirit, that the water referred to is like the amniotic fluid of the first birth, your physical birth, not the water of baptism, outward baptism. And I had never encountered that as a possible explanation. So I found that interesting to consider. Obviously Quakers overwhelmingly not observing outward sacraments. I had only ever heard that passage interpreted as it was referring to being physically baptized and the necessity of that. And I thought, well, that's a very interesting way to look at it. And in some ways it kind of resonates more so, at least for me, to think, if your whole project here is to say, if you're Jesus and you're trying to draw people into this awareness of a second birth that is spiritual, to entertain it that way, the idea that you're talking about that first physical birth into the world and then a rebirth that is more spiritual. So I thought that was an interesting approach that he took, and one I'd never thought about.
I think that's one of the traditional, as somebody who grew up Quaker, of course, that's one of the traditional understandings among friends, but they rarely talk about it. I mean, this idea of the first birth and the second birth being the physical birth, the amniotic fluid, and then the second being the baptism of the Spirit. And we always seem to shy away from talking about the sacraments in that way. I think we do ourselves a disservice, and especially to our younger friends, explaining some of these intricacies of how friends understand Scripture, which are completely in keeping with what's said, and so they are exegetical in the biblical phrase. They are parsing the Scriptures and not being eisegetical, which is reading into it what I want it to say. The I versus the E, I guess, is a real fine description or line. But again, it's very much Jesus being rabbinical, it seems to me, and bringing up these things that make people wrestle with them. I mean, he says something, but he doesn't go on to expound a whole lot about which one he means. It's like, okay, so what do you mean? And what's this got to do for us today? Um, so, and then, and then Nicodemus, it says he responds blankly or impatiently, how can these things be? And Jesus goes, and you're a teacher of Israel? I think, okay, so Jesus says this today. What will you say? It says, and so you're a good Quaker? You've been to Sunday school? You've read the Bible? You don't get it yet? I think how much we don't get because of like Nicodemus, he's so trained in a system and is part of that system, and so are we. So how open are we to revelation and to new truth? I'm not. I like things the way they are. If I was Nicodemus, I'd be going, well, how can this be? No, sorry, can't do that. I'm part of this system. But Nicodemus really seems to be seeking. I think that's part of it is, do we have seeking hearts still?
Yeah, so it is interesting for me to learn that that is an existing, concept with among friends. So yeah, I think it would be great for people to like totally be having the amniotic fluid conversation more often because it's kind of a weird, it's just weird enough that it's like that it makes me love it. It's just kind of an odd notion, and so that I think it's an attention grabber for that reason. It's really thought compelling, and I think too for me as I was reading through really the whole book again, but having been raised in a fundamentalist, very legalistic form of Christianity, I think Quakerism generally, and then material in this book, really enables me to encounter the concept of Jesus as a person, and then the whole Christ concept, etc., in some new ways that are not burdened with some of the baggage and material that I would have been taught, excuse me, in the church that I was raised in, because it lets you encounter Jesus, like you were just saying. He gives kind of a sarcastic response to Nicodemus, kind of like, and you're calling yourself a teacher, that there's a humanness going on there that in the church I was raised in, you were never really engaging with because this was Jesus, and there was such a mythology. Looking back on it, ironic for people who claim to be biblical literalists, but there was this mythology created around Jesus that he was just, it was not discernible from God versus Jesus. There was just this equating of the two to such an extent that you miss so much. That whole concept of you come to the scripture already having decided what you're going to find there, it blinds you to what really is there. Also ironic because so much of this particular, the conversations are focused so much on questions of sight, light, dark, literal blindness versus spiritual blindness and seeing. And as I was reading these conversations, I thought that really applies in terms of how I was raised in Christianity, because there was just an extreme blindness to what some of the material in the text itself about how there's just this extreme intersection between the humanness of Jesus and this divine component as well. The woman, the Samaritan woman, is another episode with that, where which we'll get to that, but he's still human enough to be caught up in this division between Jews and Samaritans a little bit. He's still, you worship what you don't know, we worship what we do know. And it's like, wow, you don't kind of expect that. You would expect him to be a little bit above that, and yet he does move you past it in that conversation ultimately, but to get there, he's still tied up a little bit in that division. And so there's some of that humanness I think is captured, at least to me, in these conversations. And that was one of those moments where he gives kind of a sarcastic answer to Nicodemus about, you're calling yourself a teacher of the law. I like to, in this conversation, the second one, I think the author points out truth is less something to be believed and more so how we live a life that embodies the word of God. I think that's an interesting dimension to this, because Jesus is talking to somebody, again, who's a teacher of the law. There's very much this idea, in my opinion, between letter of the law questions and like, what's the point of the law? What's the point of the fact that we even have a religious system or theological ideas? It's kind of getting the cart before the horse to be so caught up in this legalistic approach to the law. And so he's really putting a focus, Jesus is, on that idea of living out and embodying the word of God. So I think that was powerful. And then I have marked on a quote too that's on, I think it begins on page 18. It is ourselves in the truth of God's light that we dread to face, which I thought was an interesting. It's toward the bottom. There are 4 paragraphs. It's the third paragraph going down. We cannot blame God as some patriarchal ogre we cannot face. It is ourselves in the truth of God's light that we dread to face. The light is the warmth of God's love, but we cannot know it as love until we step into it and learn how to stay there in Christ. I had just marked that as an interesting quote too, which resonated for me as someone who, again, was raised in a mindset that God was very much, the judgment of God was very much something to be dreaded. And yet this conversation, the approach in this conversation is very much focused on the idea, at the end of the day, it's kind of yourself that you're facing more so than, a judging and an angry God.
I think that's
of course, the guided conversation.
The early Quaker testimonies that, or witnesses that we've softened over the years to this inward light, when the early friends certainly saw it not just as a guiding light, but a searching light, that would look into every corner of your life and show you where you were falling short, not in a condemnatory way per se, but where you needed to get back to God and to say, I have drifted away or something. And so it's the light calling us home by pointing out our imperfections and saying, perhaps to Nicodemus, as well as us, well, you call yourself a teacher of the law, you call yourself a good Christian, a good Quaker, you're not perfect yet. So but we prefer that softer, gentler candle light kind of idea, the inner light, instead of the searchlight approach, which is like the prisoners in the cell yard being caught out by the searchlight that they're trying to escape. And I know in my own life, how often do I try and escape that light because I really don't want to have to deal with my own shortcomings.
Yeah, that passage brought to mind that idea of the refiner's fire. Mm-hmm. I love that term. I love that concept, because there really is a little bit of I don't know that I'd go so far as to say brutality to it, but I mean, if you really think about what's communicated in the concept of a refiner's fire, a metal, iron or whatever being placed in a fire, heated to the point that it can be shaped and hammered and beaten into something new. I mean, that's pretty vivid if you really delve into that. And yeah, that whole process of the light searching out, again, we hear it, lift people into the light, the guiding of the light, and that's wonderful. I'm not criticizing any of that, but I think that the depth that's implied though by what you just described, I mean, that's a serious process, and it requires a lot of self-honesty that really has to be given rise to though by something other than yourself. It's not self this isn't We're not talking about self-help. We're not talking about really a self-directed effort. It may start there, but it's really a getting out of the way and letting the light of Christ kind of sear through your story that you've told about yourself, your identity as a teacher of the law or whoever, whatever it is. And that's kind of a earth-shaking process to go through. And I think it's consistent too. That's going back to the renaming of Simon to Peter and all of that. That's kind of that road that these people are starting down on with Jesus. And it's really not at all safe. There's nothing safe about it. You're really at peril of, in some ways, self-annihilation as far as the illusions we may have created about ourselves and the ideas and narratives we've created about ourselves, that if we really want to learn who we are in God, that may not be, a process that's so easy or gentle in some ways. And I think that that's a lot of what we're looking at here. The guided conversation talks about, thinking of a problem or unresolved issue in your life and choosing a word, about how you're feeling, and letting your body feel the truth of that, and being kind of standing still in the light and asking Christ to teach and lead you in the truth of that situation. And I thought that was an interesting one too, because the guiding, coming from Christ, you don't know where that's going to take you. And I think that there's a sense of predictability in a lot of, particularly American religion. It's all about, comfort or, the prosperity gospel or whatever may be the order of the day. But if you're really in a space where you're saying, I want to encounter truth, experience truth, then that's you being guided, and you can't really have your mind made up about what that is before you start that process. If you really expect to be led into something that you don't already know, then you're going to have to accept your own limitations. And there's, I think, a great deal of humility and, again, risk involved in that. Any other thoughts about the second conversation? Okay. The third conversation is a woman of Samaria. It's probably a story familiar to most people. Jesus encounters a Samaritan woman at a well of Jacob, I believe, if I recall correctly. And this time, the story is happening in the daytime. And so it's kind of that counterpoint to the Nicodemus conversation that's at night. And it's interesting because Nicodemus doesn't get it. And I think the author goes on to kind of show, but the woman of Samaria, at least to a far greater extent than Nicodemus, she kind of does begin to kind of at least have some concept of what Jesus is talking about. And you have this occurring at the noon hour, he says, which is a time of full illumination, in contrast to the nighttime meeting with Nicodemus. So you have the settings, and I would not have thought of that reading either story. So I really appreciated that he brought that out and created kind of the opportunity to take another layer of that story and see some symbolism at work there that at least I had never thought about. There's a lot of boundary crossing happening here. He addresses that Jew and Samaritan, man, woman, physical, spiritual. You have the discussion between how Samaritans worshipped God on Mount Gerizim and Jews in Jerusalem, and Jesus saying to her, "You worship what you don't know. We worship what we know. Salvation is from the Jews." And he's, just kind of categorically says this. But then the larger point of all of this is to, we're coming to a time when people, regardless of whether they're Samaritans or Jews, will worship God in spirit and in truth. So it's like we're heading in that direction, but it's that the whole exchange has always still been strange to me, how he still kind of gets that little bit of a dig in of like, well, you're worshiping what you don't know, and we know what we're doing over here. Granted, we're coming to a time when that's not going to be relevant, but I'm still kind of in that headspace, and that's I thought always a strange part to me about this story, and I never really know fully how to take that sometimes as far as his approach to it. Also just the theme of knowing and not knowing. I thought it was very interesting how the author brings up that maybe one of the reasons that the Samaritan woman was able to have a greater degree of openness is that women probably had less loyalty to the religious establishments of that time and place, whether that of Jerusalem or Mount Gerizim, because they were excluded in so many ways from those religious establishments. They couldn't be, priests serving in the temple. They were, very much excluded and seen as lesser than men in a patriarchal society. So maybe they weren't working with some of the stumbling blocks that someone like Nicodemus would be, who was well versed in the law and so caught up in all of that it created really like a filter through which anything that Jesus was saying to him, it had to pass through that. And it really interfered with his ability to comprehend what Jesus was trying to say to him about this idea of being reborn in a spiritual sense. Whereas the woman at the well, at first she's not sure what this living water is that he's talking about, but he's able to kind of open some of that up to her, and she has this moment of, well, I know we're waiting on the Messiah, which is this Jewish concept, but she knew about it, and she seems able to tie things up a little bit more accurately about Jesus than this guy who's really part of this, not just the power structure in Jerusalem, but very well. I mean, this would be somebody who would be like an ordained minister or something today, like the pastor of a church, and yet he lacked the insight that this woman just getting water at a well had, and she's from this group that traditionally is hostile to the Jews. I'm sitting here thinking, if this was playing out today, would she be a Palestinian woman? Who was having this exchange with him, and this extreme division, between these two peoples, and yet he's hanging out with her at this well, asking her to give him a drink and having this exchange with her. So I think that's also an interesting piece of it. The Quaker tradition section, I think, also brings in, about Margaret Fell, who's always a favorite, I think, to everybody, but I've always been a Margaret Fell fan. She wrote the tract, A Call to the Universal Seed of God, and explored, the idea that God doesn't require these outward ordinances or temples, that the inward worship is in spirit and in truth, as Jesus promises the Samaritan woman. And it always been my understanding that, early friends concluded that waiting worship, as Quakers were practicing it, was this worship in spirit and in truth. that had moved past all these ordinances, temple rites, outward forms, that they were really living out in a present way what he had told the Samaritan woman uh, would ultimately be how all people could come to worship and encounter God in spirit and in truth. That Friends, I think, saw themselves as a fulfillment of that with what they were doing.
I think there's a interesting thing that she says in there in the last paragraph. Be not entangled again with the beggarly rudiments and cardinal ordinances. It's a little harsh, it seems, also. Uh, I'm sure the Puritans didn't hear it very well. But I was thinking of Paul talking to some of the early church about going back into following the Jewish law. You've been set free from this into something higher. And his language is almost as strong as hers is. It's, that you're going to get enslaved by this again, basically. And that's what Christ came to set you free from. So once again, these people really knew their Bible very well and were able to bring it into today.
Yeah, that's why I love Margaret Fell. She's already in prison for what she's been saying and doing and writing. So she takes the time to go ahead and like roll out another barn burner that's probably going to make the establishment of the day even more angry, as you said. So I definitely enjoyed that part of him including this part from her for that very reason. You're thinking, gosh, I mean, you're in prison. I even Googled Lancaster Castle to get a picture of where she and George Fox had been in prison. And I'm thinking, you're in prison there for like a year and still your whole focus is, no, we're gonna stick to this and keep right at it regardless of the consequences. So the guided conversation here kind of focused on experiencing Christ inwardly as a living well. Encourages you to imagine someone of a faith other than yours and to sense the living water inside of them. And I think an element also of considering do you and how do you kind of draw from your own well. I thought I enjoyed that guided conversation because it does go back to that universality of the inward Christ, that it's accessible to all people all the time, regardless of any consideration, including outward forms of what we would call religion, and kind of encouraging us to engage with that and to do it through this lens of the well of living water concept. And so I thought that was an interesting again guided conversation / meditation. So I liked how he approached that as well. Any further thoughts about the third conversation? Okay.
Yeah, but I might suggest before we move on, perhaps 3 is about the right number to do.
Oh, yeah, could be.
There's a lot to think about that we've covered tonight.
Yeah, there is.
And perhaps if we break it up, we could go through, we've already planned through October. We could go into November, December, and perhaps others will join us too as we go along. Those are just my thoughts.
I agree. I think that would be fine. And in kind of preparing for tonight, I thought I'm perfectly fine, with us having the 2 sessions. If people wanted to do like a third one, fourth, whatever number we settle on, because it is you can look at a lot with each of the conversations, and I don't think you want to necessarily overburden one's mind either with there's so much content. In other words, it would be difficult to maybe get through half of the book in 2 sessions each.
Well, I'm learning a lot.
Hopefully it isn't just a stream of conscious thought on my part, because sometimes I get going and carry on. So hopefully it makes some sense. I'm working off of my notes rather than necessarily the book. So I took notes as I was reading it, and kind of pulled out the parts that were interesting to me. But now that may not necessarily be the case for other folks. There may be parts of the conversations or the scriptural passages that people find maybe more compelling than what I'm kind of extracting from it.
Well, I need to confess that I have not read the book yet. I don't have it, but I have taken notes on all of our conversation this evening, and I plan to look back over those notes, and maybe before we meet in October, I will have a chance to do some reading in it. So.
Yeah, I think the way it's divided up, it's pretty, each conversation is pretty self-contained. And I like that about it too, because he packs a lot of, I thought, really good analysis of the scriptural component, the Quaker tradition component, and then you get to the guided conversation. But I never felt like it was too much to do like one of the conversations in a sitting. With it. It was engaging. There's a ton there to really kind of work with, but you can do it without feeling like, gosh, I really have to sit down and just read and read and read. I think he just did an amazing job of containing that content to a relatively, relatively brief sections. And it's really not a big book altogether. I mean, it's pretty amazing how much, or I think it is, how much he packed in there.
It is one of Doug's shorter books. I will say, as somebody who edited one of his other books, that was quite lengthy and pretty deep as well. And Doug's going to join us next month about around 8:00. He's going to log on, and so we can pick his brain on what we've done so far, and maybe we get him to come back in December as well when we wrap up the book.
Sounds good.
Does anybody who's online besides me know Doug personally? He grew up in First Friends, Indianapolis. Yeah, so he's from here, and he pastored in Western, and he was at Noblesville for a while, and then he was at First Friends Richmond, I believe, for a while, and he's been a resident scholar at Pendle Hill and Woodbrook in England as well. So he's written a ton of books, and and he's also has a wicked sense of humor. He has a couple CDs out of one of his songs is about being a weighty friend. He says, "Lord, you don't have to be 80 to be a weighty friend, but God knows it helps." Then he has the bald song too, which he and I both relate to. So he's kind of a character.
Yeah, I'll look forward to hearing from him on it. I think it's a book I bought probably before I even found my way to West Newton, but I don't know how much of it I necessarily read at that time. And kind of found my way back to it at some point and thought, maybe other folks would like to take a look at this too, just because of the nature of it. It feels like something you could do with a group, like you were saying. I think the guided conversations would really be neat to hear other people, how they would experience, going through those conversations. Again, they're like the kind of meditations I've encountered in other traditions as well, because there's a real visualization element to some of them, and creating like an immediate encounter. You're envisioning, I think, I can't remember if it's 5 or 6, but the conversation, you're envisioning Jesus, with you, kind of interacting with this shared material. I forget what it is, if it's like a particular issue or whatever you're doing, but that's definitely, I think, a different approach, at least than any I've encountered. There's a distance often to Jesus as a person, and I think certainly to the spiritual concept of Christ. So to have an exercise where you're just kind of envisioning just you and Christ, and this exchange happening is, I think that could go in some interesting directions for people. So I would love to hear how what that might look like for other people.
Well, if friends are easy, we'll close the evening and reconvene in a month for continued conversations with each other and with Christ. And we'll hope a few more friends might join us.
Sounds like a plan.
They missed a very, very good evening.
Yes. Thank you, Jonathan, so much for your leadership. And Brent, I appreciate all of your comments as well.
Oh, definitely. Thanks to everyone for showing up. It was too much for Jet. She could only handle a few minutes of it, so she spent the entire time asleep on the bed. So I don't know what that says about her, but maybe she'll be back for the full experience next time.
Well, she did show up.
She did. She's my supervisor, so I think she just likes to make sure everything is going as she thinks it should be, and then she feels free to check out. So,
your spiritual elder.
Yes.
Here you go.
Part the way through this evening, you may have realized that I picked up my phone and went out. I have a Great Pyrenees dog, and I needed to go out and get fresh water for him. So I was outside with him a part of the time. So I take care of my furry buddies too.
They're a handful.
Okay, well, thanks everyone, and hope to see you at Meeting for Worship on Sunday.
Okay.
Right. Good to see everyone.
Yeah, good to see everyone. And thank you again, Jonathan, and you too, Brent. And
Sure.
good to see you.